position of going back and forth between this fantastic university that had changed so much in 6 years that I needed John yesterday to take me for a long walk and show me all the things that I wouldn't recognize. And between the university I'm in right now, which we pride ourselves as being a top 100 university in the Shanghai criteria, but as I'll describe today, this is a different place on that scale. Let me say that. In these years before I came to Stanford, I did what graduate students did. I read a lot of things that came from here and worked as a research assistant. At the time, I worked for a research assistant for Yuda Shenhav, who himself is an alumnus of Stanford sociology. And in among the projects for which I collected the data and ran the models is one of his publications for which the title and the finding, as I will describe it, were important for me for the rest of my studies, and which today I reflect on when I'm back on Israel. This is a paper. As I said, all I did was run the regressions. This is a paper by Yuda Shenhav and David Kamens, whose title is The Cost of Institutional Isomorphism. The models here are pretty simple. At the time, the argument was that countries that invest in science and therefore in academia, and as I'll come and describe also in universities, countries like that, gain a profit from these kinds of investment, and that is that they build what we today call a knowledge-based economy and therefore reach higher levels of development. And what they ran in these models is to show that there is indeed a positive relation, causal relation, between the scope of scientific activity in a country and the economic development, the subsequent economic development of that country. This was indeed true, but only for Western countries. For non-Western countries, there were costs to the isomorphism of adopting models such as investments in science or expanding academia. For non-Western countries, there are costs to this process of isomorphism. What the regression models in this paper show is that for developing countries, there is no relationship between the expansion of science, meaning science is very expanded because of isomorphic pressures, but there's no growth of the economy anywhere related to it. And more than that, for underdeveloped countries, the particularly poor countries, there are penalties to their investment and their expansion of science, meaning the isomorphism that pushes them into particular investment gives them penalties on their economic development. A few years later, so this is this kind of theory, but a few years later, another group from Stanford sociology, Young-Suk Jang and Hok-Yu Wang, told a very similar story about the expansion of centralized government, the number of ministries, how many spheres of responsibility a government takes itself. Again, there are great differences between the Western countries, where expanded government does mean that there are more services to citizens and also a growth in the economy, and developing countries where there are penalties or costs to that isomorphism. So with this in mind, what I want to devote my comments today to is how do these costs of isomorphism manifest themselves in Israel? How do they do so specifically regarding universities in Israel? And even more specifically than that, about the particular practice that we call internationalization and recognize as this reach out into the world that universities do and devote resources and build administrations around that. So this is going to be the theme for my short commentary today. So this is a picture quite a few of us recognize when we study universities. This is a 14th century depiction of a classroom in the University of Bologna. And we recognize this to be a university. And indeed, I just picked this off the web, but this is particularly a classroom that I teach in. You look at the classroom at the Hebrew University, it looks like a university. back in time and to the contemporary era. But in spite of universities in Israel looking very much like universities, I want to devote just a short time to show you what academia in Israel looks like. Because in some respect, the rate of growth throughout the 20th century looks a lot like what Evan Schofer and John Mayer track to be the S-curve of growth in higher education worldwide. But Israeli academia is spread this way only during the 20th century. So the first institutions to be founded were the Technion and the Hebrew University in 1924 and 1925, which is before there was a state of Israel. So it is in the interim period between World War I and the end of World War I and the start of a British mandate in the land of Palestine or the land of Israel and Israeli independence. So much of the S-curve that we see here is because of how we count universities today. Because the dramatic event in Israeli academia is actually the 1993 law that allowed for the opening of colleges. So all we had before that were research universities, and then in 1993, in a move to allow for greater access to higher education, there was the law of colleges, and what you see after that is a big jump in the number of higher education and academic institutions. But from that moment on, quite a few institutions that existed before that as all forms of training, including Bezalel Academy that was founded in 1906, suddenly became academic institutions, and we count them as if they existed before that. And the last university to be added to the pool in Israel is Ariel University, which is in occupied territories, which is very contested. I myself wrote a pamphlet about this university, but that's something else. It's just, I count it here, but it's not quite an Israeli university. But to summarize where Israeli higher education and academia are today, 62 at the moment institutions that grant academic degrees. 7 of them are research universities, plus 1, Ariel, plus 1, the Open University, which is not a research university, but nevertheless a university. And 2 out of these 7 are ranked among Shanghai's top 100. For Europeans, the ERC may be a label that we recognize. It's the European Research Council grants, which are another measure of success and excellence. Israel is 5th in the, or 7th, depending which grant, ranked 5th among recipient countries in the number of ERC grants. So overall, a very successful and very vibrant field. In terms of access and attainment, Israel is the 3rd country after Japan and Canada in the number of people who have academic credentials. So 49% of Israel's population, a particular age group, but adults, have some sort of academic credential, which is crazy. Gender, I had Evan Schofer contact me with a question, really, are 60-something% of undergrads really in Israel women? Yes, the access attainment for gender is reversed, although the scissors for whoever works on inequality is evident there too, meaning only 20% or so of full professors are women, so it's not as if the gender equality is all through levels. Palestinians, citizens of Israel, are about, in higher education, about the same share that they are in the population, again, not in full professorship. Haredi are Orthodox Jews coming in. So the system is really growing very much and changing also in themes. This year we had a flip. More engineering students than they are social sciences. So the social sciences, like anywhere else in the world, were most expanded, but no more or not, or tipped over the following year. But here we are, and I'm speaking on a panel that thinks of universities as organizations. And therefore, specifically, I want to highlight a few of the things that are specific organizational initiatives. And universities in Israel have a long list of initiatives that you would recognize from your own universities. I wrote with Achim and Giuseppe about branding and other forms of reform, for example, regarding equity and going digital for university, all sorts of initiatives. I want to, again, in the remaining of my time, to focus specifically on one initiative that is highly administrated, managerialized, and that is internationalization. So let me tell you a little bit about internationalization in Israel. In a paper I reviewed shortly ago, it was about the visual mode of internationalization on the web. And the researchers showed that over 90% of pictures that go on the website of universities about their internationalization is students jumping in the air in front of a national monument. So they go to do a year abroad in Paris, but all we know about what they do there is that they jump in front of the Eiffel Tower or in front of the London Eye. So I wanted to tell you that we too have a normal, very normal internationalization initiative, because students obviously jump in front of the monumental amphitheater of the Hebrew University. But behind that jumping, that performance of internationalization, is a great bureaucracy. And all of our universities have very elaborate stories about how they internationalize. This is the page from the Hebrew University. I clipped it only last week. And it tells a lot about how about the different activities it does around the world. And the label for Hebrew University's internationalization is impact globally. We not only have an aspiration that our students may know a foreign language or recognize a place on the other side or learn from somebody elsewhere, but the point is that impact globally. Similarly so, Ben Gurion University of the Negev goes under the label, its internationalization initiatives go Be Different, Be You, BGU. The banner hangs everywhere around their international office and on the website. So in all of these terms, it's a normal sort of initiative that is recognized elsewhere, and it is for all universities and for quite a few of the colleges in Israel, it is a strategic item in their current operations. And as a strategic item, it highlights the fact that what's important is to have a global reputation, the ranking, the recognition, etc. It highlights that what's important are research standards, that we publish in A and AAA, that we gain the ERC grants, etc. It highlights the importance of recruitment, of international students, of international faculty, of Israeli faculty that have international credentials. So one of the most important things at recruitment committees is to say where that faculty receive their PhD. And a few universities will win a spot on the faculty, and we are clearly snobs regarding that. But also the curriculum as a strategic item, important to have the study of the world, impact on the world. So we have more and more programs where part of the curriculum is to go somewhere in the world and make a difference, and to bring students and change our curriculum accordingly. So Hebrew University teaches in Hebrew. All universities in Israel teach in Hebrew. But over the past decade, we have a very dramatic increase in the number of courses, obviously, but also full degree programs that we teach in English in order to allow for foreign students to come for full degrees, not just for a quarter abroad. And as I said, and as I showed in the volume of reports online, all of this comes with managerialized bureaucracy behind it. So let's count the number of officers who are devoted specifically to internationalization, and I think there we'll see this again. The last point I said is lobbying, because it's not so easy to bring foreign students to Israel. It's not easy to have foreign faculty come and live in Israel. Our immigration laws are very strict, and it's impossible for faculty to gain residency and then to have health care benefits and kindergarten for their children in spite of this. So universities lobby as a group and individually all the time to change the whole mechanism of Israeli politics in order to play in the international arena like everybody else. What I want to highlight, and that go back to the title of Shenhav and Kamens's point, is to show that, like we all recognize about the iron cage, these kinds of strategic agenda items for universities, all of them bear a cost, and the cost of institutionalizing these particular activities. So every act the university takes bears a cost on it. For example, regarding the language issue, which is what I described, we want to internationalize by being able to bring international faculty and international students. We start teaching in English. We drop our own students because they don't have the capacity with high school language skills in English to study at the university level English. So we change the curriculum. We kind of level off so everybody could be in this. And we always struggle about how is it to be the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and not teaching Hebrew. Because it's not a coincidence that the Hebrew University chose this title. As I showed you earlier, it opened its doors 6 months after the Technion, but the Technion taught in German because it was inconceivable for scientists in 1924 that you could teach anything sensible in any language other than German. And the Hebrew University, which was devoted to the humanities, opened 6 months later. It was part of the statement is we're going to teach in Hebrew and therefore putting it in the title. And now we go back to the dilemma of, but if we want to be international and rank it internationally, we cannot do it in Hebrew. Another thing that is going on in our region these days is a lot of conferences that note the 40th anniversary for Edward Said's magnificent book, Orientalism, where Edward Said, a Palestinian from Jerusalem and a Columbia professor, talks about the post-colonial legacies that, and how they have looked at the Orient, at the Near East or Middle East, and how they have formed it into what it is these days. So in light of, by the way, this picture is of a mural in honor of Edward Said from San Francisco State that have a mural project. So this is also a point of local tourism. But what I take when reading with my students Said's Orientalism this year and pulling things that make sense for me is the 2 points about imagination and otherhood. Because Edward Said's point about Orientalism is how the Orient was imagined by Westerners and how everything about the Orient is organized around how the Westerners look at the Orient. And if you visited Jerusalem, you would recognize some points of architecture that are actually early 20th century architecture of how Western architects imagined the Orient. The Orient didn't look like that before they came, and today they are iconic for what Jerusalem is. So between thinking about the cost of isomorphism and noting Said's Orientalism, my point in looking that I want to give to you today is that we should think, when we think about universities as organizations, about how global imagination formulates universities around the world as organizations, and how much these institutional global dynamics are formulated through this process of imagination. Because the Hebrew University, somewhere on this 100 list of top Shanghai listed universities, imagines itself in reference to the West and is judged by the West. And the West speaks to it, and it speaks to the West. Somewhere in the pieces I wrote in the past few years thinking about universities, I described specifically the Harvard syndrome, or rather the Harvard off syndrome, where so many universities worldwide are known as the Harvard off wherever they are. And indeed, Hebrew University for a while was going under the label the Harvard of the Middle East, until the situation became like that. Israel is disassociating itself from the Middle East, and the label was dropped. And I know only one university that actually makes fun of this label, because Hebrew University took it for a while rather literally, in a rather presumptuous way. If you ever visited McGill, McGill sells T-shirts or sweatshirts in their shop that says Harvard, the McGill of the United States. So it's the one place that plays with this. But what you see in there is exactly this transposition of global imagination, where one looks at the other, and it's like smoke and mirrors, or mirrors standing ones against the other in order to try and make sense, and then try and make strategies based on that sense that we make of the field. So my final thoughts. The cost of isomorphism, by definition, are not evenly spread around the world. We understand it to be so, but I think we could bring these tales of imagination and think of these as institutional dynamics when we think also about universities as organizations, the strategies they set for themselves, the goals they specify for themselves, and obviously the practices with which they try and follow these up. Thank you very much for giving me this stage.